In 1918, the world was tearing itself apart. Millions were dead, empires were crumbling, and the industrial-scale slaughter of the First World War seemed like it would never end. But then, one man stepped onto the world stage and made a stunning promise, a plan to end not just this war, but every war that might follow. He offered a vision for a new world order, where secret deals were replaced by open diplomacy, and every nation, big or small, could decide its own destiny. This is the story of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of speech that was meant to save the world, but instead may have paved the road to an even greater catastrophe. To really get the importance of Wilson's speech, you have to understand the sheer desperation of the time. By 1918, the Great War had raged for 4 horrifying years. This wasn't a conflict like any other. New technologies like machine guns, poison gas, and heavy artillery had turned Europe's battlefields into a literal meat grinder, wiping out an entire generation of young men for a few inches of mud. The war itself was born from a tangled web of secret alliances and imperial ambitions. A single assassination in Sarajevo triggered a domino effect, pulling nation after nation into the abyss. The United States had tried its best to stay out of it. President Woodrow Wilson, a former Princeton University president and an academic at heart, had even won his 1916 re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson was an idealist, a man who believed in reason and diplomacy. For years, he tried to position America as a neutral peacemaker. In a 1917 speech, he called for a peace without victory, arguing that a peace forced on a loser would only leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory, and would be built on quicksand. But staying neutral became impossible. Germany's campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships with American civilians on them, forced Wilson's hand. That, plus the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret German pitch for Mexico to attack the U.S., was the final straw. America entered the war in April 1917, not just to win, but in Wilson's words, to make the world safe for democracy. This wasn't just a goal, it was a mission. Wilson believed the only way to justify sending American boys to die in European trenches was to fundamentally change the world so this could never happen again. He wasn't just trying to end a war. He wanted to end all wars. To do this, he assembled a secret team of about 150 experts, historians, geographers, economists, known as the Inquiry. Their job was monumental: diagnose the root causes of the war and create a cure. They churned out thousands of reports and maps, analyzing everything from obscure border disputes to global economics. The result of all that work, filtered through Wilson's own idealistic vision, was unveiled in a landmark speech to Congress on January 8, 1918. This speech, outlining his 14 points, wasn't just another peace proposal. It was a blueprint for a new world. Wilson's 14 points were his grand answer to stopping another global catastrophe. It wasn't just a list of demands, it was a whole new philosophy for how nations should behave. First was the theme of transparency and fairness. The very first point was a direct shot at the old European system. Open covenants of peace openly arrived at more secret treaties that could drag nations into war. This was a call for radical transparency. Next came calls for absolute freedom of the seas and the removal of economic barriers to promote free trade. Wilson's bet was that if goods could cross borders freely, maybe armies wouldn't have to. The second major theme was disarmament and decolonization. Point 4 called for nations to reduce their weapons to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. The pre-war arms race had been a huge source of tension, and Wilson wanted to dismantle the massive war machines. Then came Point 5, a truly radical idea for the time. It called for an impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, giving equal weight to the interests of the colonized people and the colonial powers. Think about that. In an age of empires, an American president was saying the desires of people in Africa and Asia should matter just as much as the ambitions of London or Paris. This was a direct challenge to the very idea of European imperialism. The third and most powerful theme was the principle of national self-determination. This idea is woven through many of the points. Wilson argued that nations should be formed based on the will of the people, not the strategic chess moves of great powers. He called for restoring Belgium, returning the Alsace-Lorraine region to France, and redrawing Italy's borders along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. Most importantly, he demanded autonomy for the peoples of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. He was essentially calling for those empires to be broken up, so groups like the Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks could finally have their own countries. For oppressed people across the globe, this was an electrifying promise of freedom. But all of this was just the setup for the grand finale. Point 14. The most famous of them all. Called for a general association of nations ... for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and cues, and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. This was the birth of the League of Nations. It was meant to be a global forum where countries could settle disputes peacefully. It was built on the idea of collective security. An attack on one is an attack on all. For Wilson, the League was the linchpin. It was the mechanism that would enforce all the other points and guarantee a permanent peace. The 14 points were seen by many, even in enemy nations, as a message of hope, a path to a just and lasting peace that helped erode the will to keep fighting. When Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris in December 1918 for the peace conference, he was greeted like a messiah. Crowds roared for him in the streets of Paris, London, and Rome. He was the first sitting U.S. president to even travel to Europe, a symbol of America's new role as a global leader. That optimism didn't last. Inside the Palace of Versailles, where the treaty was being negotiated, Wilson's idealism collided head-on with the cold, hard realism of the other Allied leaders. The conference was dominated by the Big Four: Wilson, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and the formidable Georges Clemenceau of France. And they had very different ideas about peace. Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, was nicknamed the Tiger. He'd seen his country invaded by Germany twice in his lifetime. Much of northern France was a wasteland. Millions of Frenchmen were dead. Clemenceau's goal was simple and brutal: revenge. He wanted to make sure Germany could never, ever threaten France again. He thought Wilson's 14 points were hopelessly naive, famously quipping, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why? God Almighty has only 10. He didn't want a peace without victory. He wanted a victor's peace, a peace of punishment. Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was a shrewd politician caught in the middle. He'd just won an election at home on the slogan, "Hang the Kaiser," and the British public wanted Germany to pay. But Lloyd George was also a realist. He worried that a completely crushed Germany might fall to Bolshevism, the new threat spreading from Russia. And he had an empire to protect. He was deeply skeptical of Wilson's freedom of the seas, seeing it as a threat to the Royal Navy's power. The negotiations became a bitter clash of wills. Point by point, Wilson's grand blueprint was chipped away and compromised. The idea of open covenants was immediately ignored as the Big Four met in secret for months. Germany and the other defeated powers weren't even invited to the table. Self-determination was applied hypocritically. While new nations like Poland were created, the principle was ignored when it clashed with Allied ambitions. Britain and France had no intention of giving up their colonies. Instead, they took over former German and Ottoman territories as mandates, a thinly veiled form of imperialism. Wilson found himself trapped. To save his most cherished point, the League of Nations, he had to give in on almost everything else. He agreed to harsh territorial losses for Germany. He agreed to the watered-down version of self-determination. And he even agreed to the most controversial part of the treaty, the infamous War Guilt Clause. The document that emerged from Paris in 1919 was not the peace without victory. Wilson wanted. It was the Treaty of Versailles, and for Germany, it was a profound humiliation. The centerpiece of its harshness was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the entire war. For a nation that believed it had fought a defensive war, this was a national disgrace. This clause became the legal basis for the staggering reparations the Allies demanded: 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum. The goal was to cripple the German economy for a generation. The treaty also dismantled the German military. The army was capped at 100,000 men, and it was forbidden from having an air force, tanks, or submarines. Germany was stripped of its colonies and huge chunks of its European territory. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France, and a new Polish corridor was created to give Poland access to the sea, cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. When the terms were finally presented to the Germans, they were horrified. They had agreed to an armistice based on the promise of the 14 points. They expected a negotiation. Instead, they got an ultimatum: sign or the war resumes. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace. Starving from an Allied blockade, they had no choice but to sign. On June 28, 1919 exactly, 5 years after the assassination that started the war, the German delegates signed the treaty in the Hall of Mirrors, the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed after defeating France in 1871. The symbolism was brutal and intentional. For Wilson, the treaty was a painful compromise, but he had saved the one thing he believed could redeem it all: the League of Nations. The League's charter was written directly into the treaty. Wilson gambled that, over time, the League could fix the treaty's flaws and preserve the peace. He pinned all his hopes on it. He was about to face the greatest betrayal of all. If you find this look into the complexities of our past insightful, take a moment to subscribe. We explore the critical moments that shaped our world every week, and your support helps us continue the mission. Woodrow Wilson returned home in July 1919, exhausted but hopeful. He knew the Treaty of Versailles was flawed, but he was sure the League of Nations would be seen as a triumph. He was convinced the American people and the Senate would ratify the treaty. He couldn't have been more wrong. He was met with fierce opposition in the Senate, led by Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge and his allies, the reservationists, had deep concerns about the treaty, especially Article 10 of the League's covenant. This article committed member nations to defend the territory and independence of all other members from external attack. To Lodge, this sounded like a blank check for endless war. He argued it would hand over American sovereignty to an international body and could drag U.S. soldiers into foreign conflicts without Congress's approval. On top of that, a group of irreconcilables were staunch isolationists who wanted nothing to do with Europe's problems, period. The fight was also deeply personal. Wilson, a Democrat, hadn't included any prominent Republicans in his peace delegation to Paris. This snub infuriated Lodge and the Republican Party, who now controlled the Senate and were ready to flex their muscles. In a move of pure political irony, Lodge proposed 14 reservations to the treaty, mocking Wilson's own 14 points. These were designed to protect American sovereignty, but Wilson was stubborn. Having already compromised in Paris, he refused to compromise at home. It was all or nothing. To break the deadlock, Wilson went directly to the American people. In September 1919, he launched a grueling cross-country speaking tour, trying to build public support for the League. The tour was physically punishing. He delivered dozens of passionate speeches, warning that if America didn't join the League, another world war was inevitable. Then, on September 25, 1919, after a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed. He was rushed back to Washington, where he suffered a massive stroke. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and largely incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. With Wilson on the sidelines, any chance for compromise was dead. The Senate voted on the Treaty of Versailles twice. Both times, it failed to get the two-thirds majority needed for ratification. The United States, the very country whose president had dreamed up the League of Nations, would never join it. The consequences were profound. Without the economic and military might of the United States, the League of Nations was a shadow of what Wilson had envisioned, unable to effectively deter aggression. The failure of the 14 points and the harshness of the Versailles Treaty left a legacy of bitterness, especially in Germany. The Diktat and the War Guilt Clause became powerful rallying cries for extremists like Adolf Hitler, who built his career on promising to destroy the treaty. Many historians now argue that the flawed peace of 1919 wasn't an end to war, but just a 20-year armistice. So, what was Woodrow Wilson's biggest speech really about? On the surface, the 14 points were a plan to end World War I. But it was so much more. It was a revolutionary attempt to change the very rules of the world. It was a declaration that the old ways of secret deals, imperial conquest, and brute force should be replaced by a new world of open dialogue, self-determination, and collective security. It was an incredibly idealistic vision born from the mind of a professor who truly believed he could engineer a permanent peace. The speech introduced ideas that would echo for a century, inspiring independence movements and laying the groundwork for the United Nations. But in its time, it was a spectacular failure. The speech set expectations that were impossible to meet in the brutal reality of post-war politics. Wilson's idealism was shattered against the rocks of European realism and American isolationism. The peace he helped create was a punitive, compromised peace that sowed the seeds of an even deadlier conflict. The 14-point speech was supposed to end all wars. But in its failure, it helped create the conditions for the most destructive war in human history. And that is its ultimate, tragic legacy.